Most of you are familiar with the M1 carbine. You've looked it over closely, you've fired it, and you found that it combines light weight with good accuracy at short ranges and plenty of firepower. But the Army has now increased this firepower to over 750 rounds per minute by developing the new carbine M2. With the exception of a lever on the left side of the M2, you'll find that both models are almost identical in appearance. This lever, called the selector, is also the key to the difference in functioning. When it's in the rear position, the M2 fires semi-automatically like the M1. In other words, one shot each time the trigger is pulled. But when the selector is moved forward, the M2 becomes full automatic and will continue to fire as long as the trigger is held back or until all the ammunition has been fired from the magazine. To supply its high rate of fire, a new magazine has been developed for the M2. It holds 30 rounds and is interchangeable with the 15-round magazine. The rate of fire of the M2 is between 750 and 775 rounds per minute. To see how the carbine has been modified to provide full automatic fire, we'll remove the handguard and stock and expose the working parts. And to provide a better view, we'll use a model which enlarges the working mechanism to 5 times its normal size. This operating model functions like the M1, and we'll start with a short review of semi-automatic fire by breaking into the firing cycle just as the trigger is pulled and a round is fired. The bullet is pushed through the barrel by the expanding gas, and as it passes the gas cylinder, located underneath the barrel, some of the gas enters the cylinder through this port. It strikes the piston and drives the slide to the rear, compressing the spring. Then the spring expands and pushes the slide forward. We'll remove this cover and repeat the action so you can follow the movement of the bolt. As the slide moves back, the bolt is rotated and unlocked by this cam groove. The bolt extracts and ejects the empty case. The bolt reaches the rear position, and on its way forward, it strips a new round from the magazine, chambers it, and is then rotated and locked in battery position by the cam on the slide. We'll repeat the cycle once more to watch the action of the hammer. When the bolt moves to the rear, it pushes the hammer back, compressing the hammer spring. By removing the side of the receiver, we can see how this acts on the trigger group. The sear notch on the hammer overrides the sear and allows it to rise. The bolt reaches the rear position and then goes forward, but the hammer is held in the cocked position. Here's how it's held back. This slot enables the sear to move in a lengthwise direction. When the hammer catches it, the sear is forced back until it's stopped by the trigger post. Now the hammer is cocked and a new round is in the chamber. But to fire, the trigger must first be released. When this happens, the trigger post swings down and the hammer moves forward slightly, pushing the sear back on top of the trigger post. Although the position of the sear is changed slightly, it still holds the hammer in the cocked position. The gun is now ready to fire the next round. When the trigger is pulled, it raises the trigger post and the rear end of the sear. The front end of the sear goes down and releases the hammer, which drives forward, striking the firing pin. So much for the review of the semi-automatic cycle, which functions the same in both the M1 and M2. Now let's see what the designers had to do to make the carbine fire full automatic. Several new parts were added, and some parts were modified. But despite their similarity, the guns cannot be modified in the field. Remember that in semi-automatic fire, the hammer is caught by the sear and held in the cocked position. It can't go forward unless the trigger is first released and then squeezed again. Therefore, the first thing we need to make the carbine full automatic is a device which will trip the sear even though the trigger is still depressed. It can be done by simply pushing down the front end of the sear like this, but that wouldn't be very practical. Instead, we'll call on one of the new parts, the sear trip. This is the sear trip spring and plunger. They fit into a recess on the front of the trip and keep it under tension. But before we can install this sear trip on the hammer pin, we'll have to change the lower portion of the hammer to make room for it. A new hammer has been designed with the lower part cut away. Now let's put the new hammer and trip in their relative positions and install them in the model. This part of the trip is intended to contact the sear, but if we pivot the trip, we can see that they don't quite reach. A new sear will answer that problem. It's exactly like the old one, except for a raised shoulder, which fits underneath the trip. That's all that is necessary to establish the contact. With the hammer cocked and the trigger back, the trip can now depress the sear. Next, we need something to pivot the trip. This new part, called the sear trip lever, was designed for that purpose. But before we install the lever, we'll have to replace this straight pin with a new one, called a crank pin. We'll explain the function of the crank arm later on. Right now, let's consider the new pin only as a pivot point for the lever. The rear end of the lever fits into this slot on the trip, and both are under tension of the spring. The front end, or toe of the lever, bears against a cam, which has been added to the slide. As the slide moves back, the toe of the lever is raised by the tension on the rear end. When the slide comes forward, the toe of the lever is cammed down. As the rear end of the lever moves up and down, the trip pivots accordingly. With the lever in place, the model functions like the M2 in full automatic fire. Now let's follow this automatic firing cycle. As the trigger is pressed and the first round fired, the slide moves to the rear, allowing the lever to pivot. The trip pivots under tension of its spring. This moves the trip clear of the sear. The sear now functions just as it does in semi-automatic operation. It catches the hammer and holds it in the cocked position. As the slide moves forward, the toe of the lever is cammed down. The rear end pivots the trip, which depresses the sear, releasing the hammer. Here's the whole action once more. The functioning of the lever is so timed that the bolt is fully locked before the round is fired. This same full automatic cycle of operation continues until all the ammunition in the magazine is used up or until the gunner takes his finger off the trigger. Releasing the trigger will allow the sear to be pushed back over the trigger post. The sear moves back far enough to be out of reach of the trip. Now when the trip comes down, it does not contact the sear, and the hammer remains in the cocked position until the trigger is pressed again. So much for the full automatic firing cycle. Let's look at the other side of the gun to see how all these new parts are controlled by the selector, which enables the gunner to switch from semi-automatic to full automatic fire, or vice versa. The selector is the part by which you tell the assembled M2 from the M1. It fits on the crank pin like the jaws of a wrench. This little notch has been cut in the receiver so we can install the spring, which holds the selector in position. The crank pin is rotated when the selector is moved back and forth. Now we'll turn the gun around to see what happens on the other side as the pin rotates. By removing the lever, we can see that it's not just an ordinary straight pin, but that a crank arm extends from it. When the selector is moved back and forth, this crank arm is lowered and raised. With the lever in place again, we can see that it is lowered and raised accordingly. When the selector is moved forward, the gun fires automatically because the toe of the lever is in contact with the cam on the operating slide. But when the selector is moved to the rear or semi-automatic position, the crank pin lowers the lever away from the cam. As the lever is lowered, the spring rotates the trip, raising it above the sear. Now, when the slide moves to the rear, the lever and the trip remain undisturbed, and the trigger mechanism functions just as though the full automatic feature had never been added. Although the firepower of the carbine has been increased to more than 750 rounds per minute, its original weight of about 6 pounds has only been slightly increased. It's more valuable than ever as a light, accurate shoulder weapon for the close-in type of fighting encountered in the war against the Japanese. At the present time, the Japanese Army has only one automatic shoulder weapon. It's the 8mm submachine gun, Model 100. With its 30-round clip attached, it weighs nearly 10 pounds, despite its size. The Model 100 is air-cooled and blowback operated, with a rate of fire of about 1,000 rounds per minute. But this short 10-inch barrel and a muzzle velocity of only about 1,000 feet per second limits the weapon's accuracy. Its effective range, at best, is about 150 yards, and it only fires full automatic. In comparison, the M2 is much lighter and can either pick them off one by one or wholesale.